So first of all, Frank, I just want to sincerely thank you for allowing us to come in and rampage through your house and make time for us. I know that it's not very easy, but I just want to say I've been very influenced by your work, and I have a bookshelf that's dedicated to Tejano history. I've just been really glued to all this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you a little abstract of an article I just finished. And it is just the abstract, just to give you a little idea of what direction I'm going and ask you to respond. And as I said, you won't hurt my feelings, but this is how it starts off. The El Paso Massacre, the deadliest Latinx massacre in U.S. history, was also the deadliest white supremacist attack in the United States in more than 50 years. The assassin, Patrick Crucius, told the police that he came to El Paso to kill Mexicans. In the immediate aftermath of the killings, Texas Governor Greg Abbott and his Republican colleagues have been tenacious in their efforts not only to whitewash the El Paso Massacre, but the entirety of Texas's dark history of slavery, racism, and violence against Latinos. The repudiation of the 1619 Project, the creation of the 1836 Project, and in the fierce resistance to teaching critical race theory are indicative of attempts to whitewash history. There are several significant points that are argued in the essay. The El Paso tragedy was not an aberration. It is the deplorable culmination of more than 2 centuries of white supremacist ideology's growth in the state of Texas. Anglo-racism against Latinos may be found in the very first contact between Anglos and Mexicans in Tejas. The recent atrocities at the U.S.-Mexican border have deep roots in the genocide of Native Americans and in the slavery of African Americans. What's your response?
Well, I think that there's a lot to it. It certainly is part of a larger problem of race, which is a human problem. It isn't confined to Anglo-Americans. You find it the world over. Mm-hmm. You see what's going on in China right now with the Uyghurs. As another example, interracial violence is nothing new, and I think that part of the rejection of bringing it out, of pointing to it in American society, comes from precisely people who think they're being singled out. I think it would be, we might be better off if we understood it as part of a human process, that it's a human weakness that extends throughout not only the world, but it extends throughout time. It's been with us since almost the very beginning. I would imagine that in the very earliest stages of human development, people were already dividing themselves up in various ways. And I think the reaction of the political leadership in a place like Texas, which is governed and has always been governed in a very conservative way, up until the 1930s, it was very conservative Democrats who opposed all kinds of civil rights and economic rights for minorities, whether they were black or Mexican American, and indeed before that, indigenous peoples were at the mercy of a very conservative democratic leadership. Well, those people transitioned themselves into Republicans beginning in the 1930s as a liberal Democratic Party emerged. And so Abbott and Patrick and Paxton and Jerry Patterson and all of those people are a product of...
So I think, Frank, you were talking a little bit about the Democrats and how they kind of transitioned to today's present Republicans.
Yeah, and so Abbott and the other state leaders, who all happen to be Republicans, and there doesn't seem much chance in the offing of changing that, all come from a long line of people who grew up with a particular perspective on their history, and which is being challenged. And so it isn't a matter of being Democrat I guess that's my big point. It isn't a matter of being Democrat or Republican. They used to be Democrats, now they're Republicans, but they represent a perspective that narrowly focuses on Texas, and to the degree that it does broaden its horizons, it only looks at American history. And so they feel beset upon because what's happening in terms of younger people, more diverse constituencies, and African Americans and Mexican Americans and Indigenous Americans coming forth and saying that they want their stories told. It challenges a view that had all of these groups at the peripheries. They were either obstructions to progress, or they were cogs used by the people who made things happen. And that, in the case of Mexican Americans and African Americans, they were field labor. They were the people who carried out the instructions of those who knew better. And those things are being challenged. And the only way to challenge them is to talk about the coercive nature of the systems that created the wealth, that created the power, that created the status of the people who now feel threatened. If they were to understand that better, and if they were to understand it on a worldwide stage, if they were able to understand it as part of the human conditions, that some groups have always been hegemonic, and some groups have always been subaltern, and that the challenges of one group to the other are what drives human change, then I think we would be in a much better place. But they have to be willing to be educated, and at this point, things like the 1836 Project are part of not just a reaction, but a stonewalling of the change that needs to come, in the hopes that they can co-opt the very people that they would like to marginalize and continue to marginalize in the story. At the very same time that they want to do those things, they want to co-opt them into the story somehow, and so they pay lip service, or as portions of those populations come into the middle class, they find an entry point for them through individuals who manage to rise above the common state of the population, and so they one way or another, they're trying to put off the inevitable.
Sure.
And so I don't, and so racism is in fact racism is not just a racial problem. And I think one of the things that Texas is particularly guilty of is, to put it in the vernacular, drinking the Kool-Aid of the Texas myth. And this is the biggest part of the problem, because when you talk to people in small groups and when you can explain things, they are much more understanding. But they have for so long been given this romantic and 19th century focused perspective of that history. That the people in power today, they went to schools at a time when what they were being taught was Jane Long is the mother of Texas, and Stephen F. Austin was the father of Texas. And Sam Houston was the savior, the creator of the republic. So all of these very simplistic, myth-based What I mean by myth-based is because they went beyond reality.
Right.
Jane Long was definitely not the mother of Texas because there were women having children in Texas for thousands of years.
Right.
And Stephen F. Austin, you might consider him the founder of Anglo-American Texas because he certainly did a lot of that, but you can't say that he was
Father of Texas.
he was the father of Texas but it's an analogy to George Washington, and you see that over and over again. There's the Republic is such a powerful myth. The coming of the Republic, the Texas Revolution, the decade of the Republic, and what people don't understand is just how dysfunctional the Republic actually was, and how much Texans of the time themselves wanted to find one way or another to leave the Republic behind, to join the Union. They want Maggie? Maggie?
What?
Little quieter?
Oh, that's what I was going to ask you. So.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
So the myth has played a powerful role in creating that wall, creating that perspective that it prevents a more complete and a more honest assessment and use of the past. And so I like to say that there's no reason why anybody should feel comfortable with the history.
Right.
History isn't there to make you feel comfortable. That's the way it's been used in creating the myth, in educating, and remember, and there are so many interrelated issues here. The educational system created a history that served the purposes of educating the people that you wanted to educate. And the people that you wanted to educate were essentially white, and they were essentially elite. And everybody else was just kind of along for the ride. They needed a minimal, if at all, they needed a minimal amount of education. So African Americans got black schools, Mexican Americans got Mexican schools. They were underfunded, they were under-resourced. They were an afterthought. They were required, but where were the resources put? The resources were put into educating the white population, and not even all of the white population, only certain portions of it. And the teaching materials, the histories and whatnot, were geared to that population. So there wasn't much room in the history books for African Americans and Mexican Americans and Indians, and the way they wound up there was in stereotype. Stereotypes of each of those groups, and very specific jobs in that history. In other words, the task of American Indians, of indigenous Americans, was to be an obstacle to progress.
And John, watch out with your hands on your chest because
Oh.
it'll pick up on the mic.
Okay.
The job of African Americans was to provide labor in agriculture. The job of Mexicans was to serve as kind of this border population that did all kinds of menial tasks in ranching and in farming and in everything else that supplemented the labor that African Americans did. And the movers and the shakers were white men, and particular portions of the white male population at that. So when you take all of these things into consideration, you can see why the people who are running the state now, and a portion of the white population, of the Anglo population, is very defensive, because as these groups have wanted to be included in the history, the only way they can be included in the history is as groups. So how were African Americans treated as a group? How did Mexican Americans fend for themselves and their communities in the face of an encroaching Anglo-American world that was very different from the one that they came from?
Right. I was going to ask you here. I think some of these are kind of quick questions. Only, I have quite a few out here. So, kind of rapid fire.
Yeah, sure.
So, Patrick Kusha said he came to El Paso to kill Mexicans. Is the El Paso Massacre shooting rooted in the same hatred that plagued the fronteriza communities a century ago? And I'm thinking here La Matanza and Porvenir just as examples because they're almost 100 years ago.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that the recent, I think it's more akin to a recent wave of fear that has been created by people with an agenda to, and I hate to put it this way, but it's kind of a populist agenda to govern through fear or to gain power through fear. And what you see in the El Paso Massacre is kind of the extreme example of when people act overtly and violently act on that fear. What happened at Porvenir and others was the reversal of that. It was the use of fear and intimidation to exert social control over a local population. In other words, there was an effort, and it's obvious that the Rangers were involved, to carry out instructions that would allow that area, and it happened in South Texas as well. Violence was targeted. It was more a it was a form of state sanctioned, state managed violence to carry out a statist agenda. Whether it was done on behalf of private parties or it was done on behalf of the government, the idea was to keep a certain population in its place. So whereas the El Paso Massacre is a kind of a one individual's deranged idea of how to
was it about white replacement, white genocide?
Well, it's more Maggie. Sorry. The El Paso Massacre is the result of not being able to channel fear. Well, let me start again. The El Paso Massacre is very difficult to come to grips with because it is the product of inciting people to treat other populations as threat. But it is one individual's overreaction. It is one individual's deranged behavior. Whereas, and this is where I think the state and the governing the groups at the time are more culpable than they are today, because they were actually carrying out a policy. And whether it was a policy, there was a policy to use violence to control the Mexican American population. Right. And it was part of that. And so the Porvenir Massacre was a result of that. It was actual policy implementation, if you will. which you can always then go back and say, no, that's not what we meant to do and whatnot. But in the case of El Paso, that's not it's a one person's reaction to fear mongering.
Okay. Following the El Paso Massacre, El Paso native and historian David Dorado Romo argued, and I'm quoting here, "White supremacy is something we've had to deal with for decades. It was painful to watch leaders like Governor Greg Abbott and El Paso Mayor Dee Margo blame the shooting on mental illness and argue that this atrocity was committed by an outsider. It was just another way of whitewashing," noted Romo, "but this was a white crime against people of color."
Yes and no. Again, I think that it was certainly not neither Greg Abbott nor anybody else set this guy off on that mission.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they didn't instruct him, here's a gun, here's ammunition, go out and kill Mexicans. That wasn't even done subjectively or subconsciously. This individual took it upon himself to do this. But in a way it is true, because in fostering fear of Mexican immigrants, in not understanding the history and the presence of that Mexican American indigenous influenced population all along the border region. This guy came from outside. He drove there to do this.
Sure.
With no understanding of the social, historical, economic, political context. He just found that in El Paso he was going to be able to help start the movement to get rid of Mexicans in the country.
Yeah.
That was his thought process, I believe. I'm not entirely certain of it. But what it represents is an underlying use of that fear by political elites to carry out other policy purposes. In other words, they can get votes from whites if they say that Mexican or Latino immigration is a problem along the border.
Right.
Where does that spring from? That does spring from a racist understanding of what goes on along the border.
Yeah.
So there is an underlying racial tension that has to be addressed, and because if it doesn't, it leads to these outbursts of violence, of chaotic, anarchic violence that one sees in these attacks.
I argued in my article that his choice of El Paso was as premeditated as were the murders. And the reason I argued that is I looked at the white population where he came from, and I've looked at the Hispanic population in El Paso. I've looked at where the border was, and the fact that he drove 10 hours to come down to a particular place like this, and the people coming across the border, that his way of life was changing. And one of the things that really struck me was I almost laughed at the irony of a Mexican invasion. These are the invaders coming in. They're taking my way of life. They're taking my culture. And one of the words that I heard again and again, my Texas, my culture, my identity, my way of life. I looked at the things that he wrote in the manifesto about white replacement, white genocide. I looked at the white supremacists that he liked, and there was this continuity. There was a connection that you could see, this fear that our culture, and you focused on fear, that there's a fear that our way of life is being taken. And I kind of it's very interesting. It's almost like the idea that this is a last ditch effort. He says in there, I am not the aggressor, all right? I'm the defender. I'm the defender of my culture. It's the Mexicans that are taking our way of life. And that's why I think that it was well thought out of why are you coming to El Paso Juarez. It wasn't, I saw that as a border community, and knew what was going to happen there.
Oh no, definitely. I mean, even deranged minds perform based on their own logic. The Nazis are a great example of that. You just
Yeah.
create your own logic, and then you follow that logic to its
Oh, yeah.
logical conclusion,
Sure.
right? But it doesn't. And that's what I guess that's the point I was trying to make earlier on. That it's because they grew up with a history that placed people in particular places in the hierarchy of society. What they are doing, the political elites are doing, is they unfortunately one party a lot more than the other, is they are taking fear or they are taking history as a scapegoat in order to justify keeping the status quo as much as possible and retaining power as
Right.
much as they possibly can. And so fear becomes, and I think that one sees that in populist politicians, and you see it in many at many points in history where fear is used as a method of social control.
Well, I
Fear
was
in the other. And
thinking in Australia and New Zealand and Germany and then the marches, Jews will not replace us.
Exactly.
You will not replace us. This, as you said, it's a fear that this was happening. It's almost like reverse colonization too. It's not like we can forget about the past when the Texians took the land away. This is somebody coming again. That ownership is coming to my Texas. My culture, my identity is being challenged here. It's the Mexicans that are doing that. And another thing too, he didn't care. I mean, there were people that were citizens. It didn't matter to Crucius whether they were Mexican American who was a citizen or not. It was the culture and the fact that they were not the elites that he lashed out on, and the connection with the other manifestos. If you see I've read the manifesto in New Zealand, the mosque, and in Germany, and there is that theme that links them, and there's evidence that Crucius had read those.
Yeah.
He seems to have said, he said in the very beginning, he said Mexicans were not my target until I read the White Replacement.
yeah.
Then they became my target.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
And so it's absolutely true that there is there's a racial component to this, but it's the point I tried to make earlier. It's nothing. It's nothing new, and it's not confined to any particular group. And as a matter of fact, I'll often point out to people that we in the United States look south of the border and all we see is Mexicans. But if you are in Mexico, then there are many varieties of Mexican, and some Mexicans have higher status than other Mexicans. Mexico has its own racial issues.
Oh yeah.
And that's one of the great ironies, right? Because once they cross that border, they're just Mexicans, and they're part of this invasion, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're in Mexico, then you are. In fact, you could be any number of indigenous groups that form a very substantial portion of the Mexican population, and which suffers from as poor social and economic conditions as many groups here in the United States. And it brings up those questions of internal colonization and what methods of social control do you use to keep those populations under control, right, in check, where you want them in terms of the socioeconomic order. The problem is that you can take that. It's difficult to manage fear, because you don't know how big a reaction you're going to get thankfully, most of the time, all that fear does is create an incentive to vote for people who are espousing that they will deal with that fear. So Abbott hopes to profit from this rather hard line that he's taken on the border. He hopes to profit from it at the ballot box.
Sure.
He is using state resources to promote his reelection. He is using state resources to promote his party's standing and his party's future. And to that degree, it's problematic because it gives people like Hooch the sense that there is, at the end of the day, there's going to be support for taking that extreme position, just going out down there and indiscriminately killing people. So you're not going to get rid of these manifestos. You're not going to get rid of these. Mein Kampf is still selling well, unfortunately, and so it's a human failing that we can only that even when you try to tackle it, the result is that there's pushback because it threatens the mechanisms they use to exercise that self-control, that social control. If you make a more inclusive history, if you tell too much of the story of oppression and marginalization, it threatens their ability to govern by keeping you fearful of people. Because one, it says these people have been here all along, because you can't oppress somebody who hasn't been around. Two, it might create sympathy for people. Oh my gosh, weren't they treated horribly? Can't we do better? Which is one of the things that they fear the most, which is why they pass a law that says you can't have people feel uncomfortable with. I don't understand it, because if there's one thing that history should do, is it should make you uncomfortable. The past is not perfect, and it's not perfect on anybody's side, and so it becomes problematic to say that you can't talk about Jews because it'll make them feel uncomfortable, and yet we have massacres at synagogues. And the interesting thing about the one I can't remember if it was the one in California where the guy just started shooting.
San Diego?
Yeah, started shooting, and he didn't even stop to ask people whether they were Jewish or not.
Right. Yeah.
And that's where the fear becomes really irrational. You go to El Paso and you start shooting, and you may get Mexicans, but you may get other people. You may get Lebanese, and you may get... This is a very diverse place, no matter what you think.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I have a couple questions that are kind of interconnected, intertwined, and I wanted to ask you that, and these are kind of like, I want to ask you for our audience, people out there, because we hear this, what is a Tejano? And I wanted to know if Professor Tijerina had coined the term. I think you may have written that down. I may have read that somewhere.
Yeah, I did research. It's not finished. It's one of the projects I've got to get back to at some point.
Okay.
But I've been trying to pin down when Tejano started being used, at least in historical terms, to define a certain aspect of the Mexican American experience in Texas. And yes, I believe that Andres Tijerina was the first one to use it in the context of the Mexican Texan population.
Well, ask him in an hour.
You'll be able to.
He'll be able to
yes, and so Tejano, and again, it varies, right? Because we have Tejano music, but Tejano music is something that it develops in the last 50, 60 years out of norteño music. And I'm not a musicologist, so don't take me beyond that.
Okay.
But the point is that you've got these Mexican influences, and then there's American influences, and when you combine them, you get a particular form of Texas Mexican music. Interestingly enough, you don't have Tejano cuisine, but you do have Tex-Mex cuisine. So these are all cultural terms that have been in flux for some period of time. But to answer the question directly on Tejano, Tejano is a Spanish word for Texan. And so back in the 19th century, it was anybody who was from Texas was a Tejano. If you were a Spanish speaker, you wouldn't, if you're speaking to another person in Spanish, you're not going to say, él es un Texan. You're going to say él es un Tejano, but the Tejano could be an Anglo, the Tejano could be an African American, the Tejano could be a Mexican.
Right.
What happened in the 1970s when and this is why I think Andres Tijerina is the person who first uses it this way. There was an effort, well, actually it goes back a little bit further, maybe the 1960s. There was an effort to sort of distinguish the Mexican Texan population from other groups, from Nuevo Mexicanos and Californios. And so in that process, what Andres hit upon was that rather than using the very clunky Mexico-Texan, or Mexico-Texian, that the Spanish word Tejano could apply to the Spanish-speaking portion of the Texas population that he was studying, and it was the population of the 1820s and 1830s, who would have been called by other Mexicans Tejanos in Spanish, but they were also calling the Anglos Tejanos as well. So what Andres and then some of the people who followed him wind up doing is they wind up defining it, strictly speaking, as a shorthand way of referring to the Mexican Texan population of the Mexican Republic period of that part of the 19th century. The problem with the term became that it got expanded to include populations that did not consider themselves Mexican Texan. So for instance, the population in the valley up until 1848, they were Tamalipecos, they were Coahuilenses, they were Chihuahuans, but when that whole border along the Rio Grande becomes incorporated, all of these people all of a sudden are technically Texans, but they're not. They aren't Tejanos either. But over time, they kind of got incorporated into that Tejano definition, and then our presentism, our wanting to look at things in the past the way we look at things in the present, just homogenized them.
Sure.
But one of the interesting things is the population in El Paso does not use the word Tejano at all. They don't see themselves. So it's a very distinct population with Mexican roots. And it's distinct from a very distinct population in the lower Rio Grande Valley with Mexican roots, which is different from a very distinct population with Mexican roots in San Antonio and Central Texas. So it's fun being a historian because you never get to the end of it.
It's evolved. One of the things I read recently, I watched you in a video that hit me, and I'm thinking for me more like in the American Revolution. And I told you about Northern Ireland with the problem of identity, and it resonated that the border was constantly changing on Tejanos. You had said they were asked to give up being Spanish, and then Mexican, and then Texan, and then to become U.S. citizens. And you talked a little bit about a statelessness for Tejanos. All right, the statelessness. Did Tejanos have an identity crisis?
I think Tejanos, well, certainly on an individual basis they did. And more research needs to be done on that. And I think it is possible. We have access to newspapers and other documentary sources that, and we can go back to the 1850s and look at the way that the Tejano or the Mexican American elites in the lower Rio Grande Valley, for instance, are looking at the influx of Anglo-Texans and Americans into that area, and how they are trying to remain independent and in control of that region in opposition to the government in Austin. So it's very interesting that there's a movement in the lower Rio Grande Valley to ask the United States to separate the valley from the rest of Texas. So it's obvious that, and you see in things like the Salt War and whatnot, there's an identification with place that is not an identification with Texas. There are people who are more than happy to cross the border if things aren't what they believe they should be. The case with which I am most familiar with, Juan Seguin, is an example of this, where he fled Texas in 1842. He comes back in 1848. He leaves periodically to participate in the Mexican Civil Wars of the mid-19th century. He continually, and I think if there's one consistency with him, he continually identifies himself as a Federalist. But that can be a Federalist in kind of a Texas context, and it can be a Federalist in the Mexican context. He seems to be very ambivalent, if not downright opposed to Texas joining the Union. And so there is much study that needs to be done to sort of get to the bottom of how Mexican Americans and how Tejanos sort of see themselves as part of these new sovereignties as they evolve and devolve and then re-evolve in the middle of the 19th century. It's a very tense time. And again, my attitude is not to look at Texas parochially, to try to always see Texas in a bigger picture. And if you look at what goes on in the East, are people identifying themselves first as Virginian or South Carolinian, or are they identifying themselves as as Americans? And at the beginning of the Civil War, it is obvious that many people did not see themselves as American. And some of them couldn't come to see themselves as Confederates even. They saw themselves, strictly speaking, as Georgians and South Carolinians and Virginians and even Texans. And they resented having to go to war for the Confederacy.
Patrick Henry raised up his hand and said, "My country," he meant Virginia. And I tell him, think of the localism, how provincial my country is. It's not the United States of America.
No.
Smell the whole rat in the Constitution. It's this kind of localism. The reason I ask that is that it seems to me that if you were having been asked to give up being Spanish or Mexican or Texas or Texan or Tejano and all this kind of stuff, you'd hard pressed that you wouldn't go through some kind of identity, try to figure out, who you are. I think you provided a really good segue about Juan Seguin here, and you're doing an article about his father. Mm-hmm. Can you, for the benefit again of the audience, just kind of quickly, like an overview, why should we know Juan Seguin?
Well, we should know Juan Seguin because he has become representative of a group of, let's face it, men who were the heirs of Spanish and Mexican Texas. Their families had been here since the 18th century. They were for lack of a better term at the moment, the political elite. And they saw themselves as the defenders of the interests of their communities. And so Juan Seguin is brought up to know that he will be a civic and political leader. And at the time that the Texas War of Independence breaks out, he's a young man, and he becomes the most prominent Tejano, Mexican-Texan military figure. And so he's at a time when the revolution seemed to be all about Anglo-Americans facing off a despotic Mexican government. He, in military terms, just as Jose Antonio Navarro and Francisco Ruiz and others do it in political terms, he represents the Tejano leadership in saying that there is good cause to side with independence, with separation from Mexico. But he has a tragic story, because even though he rises in rank from captain to colonel to senator in the Republic Senate and whatnot, and to serve as mayor of San Antonio, he is caught up in the way that Texas is changing from a region that is diverse, that has a kind of an agreement between the Mexican elite, the Mexican Texan elite, and the Anglo elite over what should be the proper place of what the proper roles for these groups are, to one that's being dominated by Anglo-Americans. And so he's chased out of town. He eventually takes refuge in Mexico. He joins the Mexican military. He patrols the border. He actually carries out a couple of incursions north of the Rio Grande, but as far as I've been able to tell, south of the old border between Texas and Coahuila and Texas and Tamaulipas, which is essentially the Nueces River. Which brings up the other matter of what is Texas? And Texas today is made up of 5 different Mexican jurisdictions: Texas proper, Tamaulipas, Coahuila, Chihuahua, and New Mexico. It creates problems. It creates conflict. It changes relationships, and Juan Seguin gets caught up in it. And so he, at the end of the Mexican War, he decides to return to Texas. He becomes involved in Texas politics in the 1850s, but then periodically returns to Mexico to fight in the Mexican civil wars of the times, la Guerra de la Reforma and so forth. He is at the Battle of Puebla, so he participates in the French occupation of Mexico. He leads a very interesting life, but he never actually is able to find a home in one place or the other. It's very interesting to me. It was kind of sad. In the 1870s, he asked the Mexican government for a pension for all the military work he had done for them. They deny him because he was never part of the regular army. So he's denied a pension from the Mexican, but he gets a pension from Texas, from the state of Texas, for his service in the Revolution.
Right.
I mean, it's just a history. It's a biography that's full of contradictions, and those contradictions started with his father, who gets caught up in the Mexican War of Independence and accused of treason by the royal government for having written letters on behalf of an insurgent, Jose Alvarez Toledo, but he defends himself, saying he's a loyalist. He's always been loyal. He was under duress. He wrote those letters. He rises up out of that. At the end of the colonial period, he's alcalde. He's the mayor. He's a magistrate in San Antonio. And then in the early Mexican period, he goes off to represent Mexico at the Constitutional Convention of 1823, 1824. So he's a royalist. He's a traitor. He's a royalist. He's a Mexican. He's the representative of Texas. These men are full of contradictions. They are often contradictions that are forced on them.
I don't know what just shut off. Must have been your GoPro. Yeah, your GoPro shut off.
Okay.
And
All
it's
right.
It's after 11. I don't know what your time is.
11:22.
Yeah.
All right. So I think there's well, I had a couple of other questions. Are we good to
Do
continue
you
on?
want that still rolling? I can get that powered up.
Oh yeah, sure. Sure. Yeah, one of the things that I just as we were talking about this, I was thinking to tell my off the cuff where John Adams said, 1/3 of the people were patriots, and 1/3 were Tories and loyalists, and 1/3 buried their head. I think one of the things you helped me understand is that it's not like the Tejanos are this monolith. Like they think, oh, this is this. Some people that were fighting against the centralism of a Santa Ana, that was their objective, and things start to change in a direction that they don't like. They didn't sign up for that.
Yep.
Somebody else wants this.
Yep.
And I think that's very important to kind of break it down. I always like telling my students that the American Revolution. I remember my doctoral exam for explain why the American Revolution was our first civil war.
Yeah.
That was my first kind of question. Where students they think that the people were homogenized and everybody was against the British government. It was this fight against tyranny and all that. And then you realize, wow, people had all. I said, Benjamin Franklin ended up being a patriot, but his son from governor of New Jersey,
last governor of New Jersey,
New Jersey was a loyalist. Yeah. So I would kind of explain that. So how does that work in the family? And
what I find fascinating is the big difference between what happens in Mexico, at least in the immediate post independence period, and what happens in the United States. Because in the United States, how many Tories wind up in positions of authority? How many of them wind up as power brokers? And I don't know that it happens at all.
Right.
But in Mexico, and you've got to hand it to Iturbide, he manages to, at least for a while, sort of tamp down the forces that can lead to complete and utter chaos by creating this sense that, okay, what we were fighting was ruled by Spain, but we're all Mexicans. So it doesn't matter if you were fighting on the royalist side or you were fighting on the insurgent side. Now it's all time to band together as Mexicans. So what you get even in places like San Antonio is people like Juan Seguin and Jose Antonio Saucedo, who espoused royalists. They remained loyalists to the very end, and they held office under the crown and everything else. Joining forces with Juan Martín Veramendi and Francisco Ruiz and in Navarro, who were essentially insurgents and then pardoned insurgents. And so there is a and this is what I'm studying now, and I'm trying to wrap my head around it. There is a sense that what's important is the local, the prospects of the local community, and that no matter which side you were on politically before, the important thing right now is to figure out a way of making Texas work for Tejanos, and to the degree that that's the case. We need these Anglo-Americans because they will help us with that prosperity.
Sure.
And it just came back to bite them on the ass. But
yeah, sure. I wanted to. These probably I think we're running out of time here. Maybe like 1 minute answers or something.
Yep.
And some of it, I believe now that you've answered some of this. I mean, I suspect I know the kind of a direction, but I want to kind of put this out. And I think this is from Raul Ramos from University of Houston. He wrote that. But it says, there's a GoPro again.
What is it complaining about now? Busy. Sorry. I like this card.
was joking with my wife that if you had limited time and if you asked me these questions, my answers would be yes, yes, no, maybe. I don't think so.
Yeah, well, I find it, I love the people and I love the interview, so I can sit here for a
Yeah.
while. But what often happens is, as I said, if I kind of go through the parts, and I was watching my colleague, there's a PBS Borderlands about the San Gabriel mission, and he works there in addition.
Oh,
and,
okay.
and what I think it was about, very conflicted ideas. There was this one lady there that said, "Oh my God, I love the San Gabriel mission. I love the way that we were." And oh my God, no. This represents, racism and hard work and all this. But, you have these different stories, and they're talking about the Tongva, and they're talking about, different languages. But what they did very well in there, and it's very, low budget in the sense that there's not a lot of graphics and stuff like that. But it's being able to say, it would be like you cover hey, what were the causes of the revolution of 1910? And then it's like the baton. These are the implications. We had so many Mexicans fleeing violence. They came in, it was land pressure, and it was this. It's no coincidence that the lynching in the 1920s or the railroad came in 1904. But it's almost like a connecting, and sometimes they double back. One of the things I told Jim I wanted to do was sometimes I just love asking the scholars the same questions, and you're getting very different, responses, from them. And I want to say, just so I'm listening, I think maybe I understand why my article needs to be toned down maybe a little bit. I think you've given me some insight, because I think mine is I just called out, and I think some people really like the article.
Sure.
When I asked if I could have made it to Houston, I'm in 3 different places. I'm here, and I got to go to the Alamo and then El Paso in a week, so I couldn't make it up to Houston.
Right.
But I was very interested in his article about what the Alamo represented, and I have a couple, real quick questions.
There were locals at the Alamo, and you get a whole bunch of families, of descendants, who are very proud of their ancestors having been in the Alamo and fought against Santa Anna and sacrificed for liberty. And they feel just as offended as Anglo descendants and Anglos generally when you tell them that they were fighting for slavery.
Sure. It's one of the,
and because they were there too. So and this is why I said to you at the beginning that part of the thing is not being Tejano myself, not being Mexican American myself. I'm fascinated by the historical problem of trying to understand these people, but I'm not invested emotionally the way many of these people are. Let me see if I can just stop my phone from ringing. Because of course today, not handy. I need some help on this.
You need something from me?
Yeah, it's just so much to do.
Yeah.
Just a lot of huge data flow.
So I hope you're getting some of what you want. I don't know how.
Yeah, the thing is that I think what I'd like to do is look at the material. There's so much pressure, on the person being interviewed and the person doing the interview. There's, certain things. I think really what you've done, it's like I find myself, I really argued strongly for the idea of, I heard many professors say El Paso was not an aberration. But they didn't, it was a statement, but there wasn't really a lot of backing. Why was it not? I agreed with it. Some people did. But I just started to look at what was going on with the land grants of 1821 and the first kind of contact. I was very influenced by Reginald Horseman's when he talked about Anglo-Saxonism and how, Anglo-Saxonism was about constitutionalism and colonialism and British laws. And how it evolved into this virulent racism. and where he puts it is really in the 1830s and 1840s. He's talking about the Battle of the Alamo, the Mexican-American War, the hierarchy that's being set up, and where people of color are at the very bottom. And I think he does a very good job where he transitioned from what people thought it meant to, and something I learned, manifest destiny the term did not take off immediately.
Right.
It was something that, and then all of a sudden but I found a lot more an Anglo-Saxon supremacy that I could see that kind of transition from what I read, and then I started. And the thing is, I teach all of U.S. history, British history, global history, and all world history. So I would teach this period, but I can't say that I really went into read the diaries and the letters and all the stuff for the people. For example, if you think about Stephen Austin, in theory against the institution of slavery, but then saying Texas will never survive without slavery. It's cotton. So I like to put that. Why do we choose the people at the Alamo fighting for their liberty and freedom? Of what? What were they, fighting for? Was it the, Santa Ana centralist, position? Was it their right to own slaves out there?
It's all mixed together.
Sure.
It's all the same thing.
Right.
And if you stop to look at if you stop to think about it, when you have a struggle for liberty, it isn't an abstract liberty. It's what liberty means to you. Sure. And so we have this sense that liberty is kind of universal, and liberty is liberty. Liberty is liberty. It's an absolute.
Right.
But that's not the way these guys thought about liberty. For them, there's no contradiction in talking about liberty. And in fact, the very language that they're using when they're condemning the Santa Ana and the Centralists for enslaving people. We're fighting not to be enslaved. We want to be a country of free men. We want to have liberty. It's because their definition doesn't include a certain portion of the population. It only includes people who are like them.
I was thinking of, the French Revolution, before the French Revolution, where the French said, what the hell are these? They put a tax on your wine, and, the sugar tax and a stamp duty, and you're oppressed. I mean, we said, once the American Revolution, the French said, this is a freaking revolution, what you guys went through. And I think that what you're talking about, I see it as like sucking rarefied oxygen, where you get the Texians that really, oh my God, we're oppressed by this government that's in Mexico City. Wait a minute, what are the rules and regulations? If there's slavery's been abolished, but you come in and you bring slaves, you're in someone else's country. If the fact is that you're an illegal, alien in some other places, you're a Mexican national, this is someone else's. Where's the oppression come? And I'm not telling you anything, but people say, come on, man, call it what it was, a land grab. That's what it was. They're arguing for the institution of slavery, and it's never going to work in Texas. If cotton is the way forward, we have to have slave labor, hierarchies being set up, and But I think you hit on a very good point about what liberty means to you. I think you might even look at the mask today. Oh my God, if I have to wear a mask,
exactly.
My liberty's being taken away from me. You are oppressing me.
Exactly. And it's all about me.
Exactly.
It's not about the greater good.
Yeah.
It's about me.
Well, I say your liberty ends when you impinge upon. I don't care if you don't wear a mask.
But there's a lot of people who don't think that way.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's and I think this is what's important about going back in time.
Right.
Not only do not a lot of people not think that way, it is very difficult to get into the heads of people who've been dead for a couple hundred years. Really hard to get into the head. But that's kind of what you need to do. Otherwise, you wind up with this presentist argument it's like that. I don't know if you ever got a chance to see it. Jose Cuellar, back in the 70s for PBS, he did a film on Juan Seguin, and he turned Juan Seguin into a feminist radical. And it just, my jaw just dropped when I said, how ahistorical can you possibly be? So we want to understand what these people were fighting for, and it's too simplistic. It's land grabbing certainly was an element, but my argument would be not in the way that most people think, because what a lot of the Texans, not the ones who were coming in from the United States, who were being offered land to fight, so that's a kind of a land grab. But many of the colonists who decided to side with the revolution, what they were opposed to was the land speculators who were in cahoots with government officials down in Coahuila to give away land to friends and to sell land for speculation and whatnot, because they thought that the land should be given to actual colonists, settlers. So the land grab cause, in fact, is a cause of the revolution, but it's a two-edged sword.
Yeah, I find it very interesting when you think that in 1820 you could buy an acre of American land for $1.25, and Mexico was given for 10 cents an acre, and you don't have to pay taxes for 7 years and all of that, and nominally speak Spanish and be a good Catholic and be from a good family. I mean, when I start looking at that, I start where is all the oppression? I see a lot of oppression taking place. And then the other thing that you talk about, and it's interesting too, because when I always think of the Federalists, I have to remind myself it's centralist and Federalist, not our Hamilton the Federalist and John Adams the Federalist, and what is that contest all about? But it's very interesting too when people fighting against the tyranny of Santa Anna as outsiders. Where's the tyranny? Is not the way you want it to go. There's localism. People want to run their own states as opposed to this. But the rhetoric is very interesting. The way you depict somebody in the whole story we have to overthrow. I have in the period of the 1840s, and I quoted this, but it was Sam Houston said, basically there is no need to apologize for taking all this land away, because these Mexicans have abandoned the Anglo-Saxon heritage. And he depicts himself as the defender of Anglo-Saxon, as the Mexicans are the aggressor.
Yeah.
And I found that connection with Patrick Cruz, that I'm a defender. I'm not the aggressor. Someone else is coming in here, and I'm the defender of my culture.
Yeah, but there probably is a bit more similarity than not. But the problem, the underlying problem, is that the historical context was very different, because what you have is this Anglo-American westward expansion in which Mexican Americans are very little different from indigenous Americans who stood in the way of progress. They stood in the way of and what you see in the documents, even of the colonial period, is the Indians don't use the land. They don't know how to use the land. The land is unoccupied. The Indians just roam around. They're on the land, but they don't cultivate it. They're not building homesteads. They're not putting up hedges and fences. They're not plowing. They're not doing all these things that are the way, just like liberty. There's a real clear definition of what it means to be civilized.
Sure.
And the indigenous populations don't fit that definition. And a large part of the Mexican population does not fit that definition. So what we have to make way for is people who can fulfill the potential of the land.
Sure. Well, one of the things I asked you about before, and I don't think I finished it up, but it was very interesting, like with the Fandango, where this gentleman comes in to castigate these lewd women, and showing off all of their bodies, and then he starts to fall in this incredible language. And I was talking to Jim about this kind of idea where you hear this again. These Mexicans work for 3 hours and they quit. They put food on the table. They can't wait to game. They can't wait to go and play games, and they have the music and they do all this. And I said, well, and I'm this type A person. I think I got it wrong and they got it right. But you see the clash of cultures. If you're not working 50 weeks of the year and taking 2 off, and you're not putting money away and you're not doing that, so when it's like when I think when you other somebody, and I think that was a part of Dana. When you other somebody, it's not just that you're othering them. If you're talking about yourself, Frank's lazy. He works 3 hours a day. I'm somebody who works 12 hours a day.
Exactly.
I'm a Protestant. He's a superstitious, Catholic.
Yeah.
He's always gaming. He never puts anything for a rainy day. But
And the Spanish missionaries were saying the very same things about the Indians.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're probably getting out of time here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What time's our next interview?
Well, it's at 1, but we have to set up.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, bring out everything.
Yeah.
Battery,
Okay.
Card.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if there's any. I think what I got from it was not what I anticipated.
Oh, okay.
In a positive way. No, I mean it seriously. But I think that every once in a while to kind of focus on a global perspective has given me different kind of and I think also this idea that you're talking about, this idea of liberty, and I probably exaggerated the connections with Patrick Crucius and white supremacy and other. It's interesting. I talked to Brian DeLay who about Native Americans, and I will go up to Berkeley and see him. And he said, John, I think you're really onto something. And I said, the trouble is I have all these little chapters and I'm trying to bring it together. Yeah. And he said, John, where I see this is me. I said, I think the glue here is white supremacy that brings it all together. And I said, that's funny. I just wrote that in the article.
Well, you're not. I mean, you're right.
Right.
I just think that the problem is that if you just it's like what the right has hitched on this critical race theory.
Sure.
So what's behind? What does that mean? What does critical race theory mean? Well, how does it actually play out? And so the same thing goes for white supremacy. It's easy to say white supremacy, but where is it coming from? How does it actually play out? And are you using it as a cudgel? Or are you trying to understand that it's just a process that evolved over time that is not particular to Texas or even to the United States, but that you can see this wherever Western civilization has gone, and it's a problem of the last 1,000 years.
Sure, I would agree with that, but also it's like when you're looking for gold, Texas seems like a real good place to look for white supremacy.
Oh yeah, no, Texas is a great place to look for white supremacy.
Yeah,
but it does come from deeper roots.
Oh, sure, there's no doubt about that.
And it is, and the problem is that just yelling white supremacist. I've never been one to just want to just yell
Sure.
at people, put them on the defensive, because you don't get very far when you put them on. I mean, I talk to the Daughters of the Republic of Texas. I talk to the Sons of the Republic of Texas. I talk to all of these groups. I try to couch these things in a historical narrative that tries to get them to think about it. Because as soon as you say white supremacist, just like when you see critical race theory, it's like Pavlovian response.
Sure.
You just get the drooling and the mouth and the barking, and they don't want, and they don't hear anything else.
Well, I'm going to be hopefully. Anyway, Frank,